In the early years of the Battle of the Atlantic, German U-boat commanders believed that the vastness of the ocean itself was one of their greatest advantages. The Atlantic stretched across thousands of miles of open water, connecting North America to Europe through some of the largest shipping lanes in the world. Merchant convoys carrying fuel, weapons, vehicles, and supplies crossed this ocean constantly, forming the lifeline that kept Britain and Allied forces operating. For the submarine crews patrolling beneath those waters, the ocean was not just a battlefield. It was a hiding place. The sheer size of the Atlantic made it extremely difficult for Allied forces to monitor every section of ocean at once. Convoys might travel for days without encountering aircraft or major naval patrols, especially once they moved far from land. While escorts such as destroyers and corvettes accompanied these convoys, their sonar equipment only covered a limited area around the ships. A submarine operating quietly at a distance could remain completely undetected while observing the convoy's course and speed. German U-boat commanders understood how to exploit this environment. Submarines were designed for long-range patrols and could travel hundreds of miles from their baseports to intercept shipping routes. Once a convoy was spotted, the submarine would often report its position to other nearby U-boats. Soon, several submarines might converge on the same convoy, preparing coordinated attacks that would strike from different directions. These operations relied heavily on the assumption that the open ocean gave submarines room to maneuver without constant observation. Another factor reinforcing this belief was the limited reach of Allied aircraft during the early stages of the war. Aircraft were extremely effective at spotting submarines on the surface, but most patrol planes were based on land and could only fly a certain distance before needing to return. As convoys moved deeper into the Atlantic, they eventually entered regions where aircraft could not patrol overhead. In these areas, submarines were far less likely to be detected before launching their attacks. For U-boat crews, this created a powerful sense of confidence. When a submarine surfaced at night in the middle of the Atlantic, the horizon often appeared empty in every direction. There were no searchlights scanning the waves and no aircraft engines overhead. The only sounds were the wind and the rolling of the sea against the hull. In such conditions, it was easy to believe that the ocean itself provided protection. The strategy seemed logical. The Atlantic was enormous, the patrol areas were vast, and the convoys had to cross the ocean no matter how dangerous the journey became. As long as submarines could move freely through those waters without constant aerial surveillance, many commanders believed they would always retain the advantage. But across the same ocean, Allied planners were beginning to test a new idea, one that would soon allow aircraft to search even the most distant parts of the Atlantic. During the early years of the Battle of the Atlantic, German U-boats quickly became one of the most dangerous threats facing Allied supply routes. Britain depended heavily on shipments arriving from North America, and thousands of merchant ships crossed the Atlantic carrying essential resources such as fuel, food, ammunition, and vehicles. These convoys formed the backbone of Allied logistics, but they also presented tempting targets for submarines designed specifically to disrupt those supply lines. German naval strategy focused on attacking these convoys before they could reach their destinations. U-boats were not intended to fight large naval battles against fleets of warships. Instead, their purpose was to intercept merchant traffic and slowly reduce the flow of supplies reaching Britain. Submarine commanders were trained to patrol known shipping routes, searching for convoys moving across the Atlantic. Once a convoy was located, the submarine could follow it silently from a distance while preparing for an attack. One of the most effective tactics used by the German submarine fleet was the coordinated wolfpack attack. When a submarine discovered a convoy, the commander would send a radio message reporting its position. Other U-boats operating in the region would then move toward the same location. Instead of a single submarine attacking alone, multiple submarines could gather around the convoy and strike together. This tactic increased the chances of torpedo hits and overwhelmed the convoy's escort ships, which struggled to track several submarines attacking from different directions. Night operations played a crucial role in these attacks. Submarines were capable of traveling faster on the surface than when submerged, and during nighttime they could approach convoys without being easily detected. In darkness, a surfaced submarine could maneuver close to the merchant ships and launch torpedoes before quickly diving beneath the waves. Once submerged, it became much harder for escort ships to locate the attacker using sonar. Convoy escorts attempted to counter these tactics with depth charges and sonar detection systems, but they faced significant challenges. A convoy might stretch across several kilometers of ocean, and the escort ships had to guard a wide perimeter around the formation. Even with several escorts working together, there were often gaps in coverage where a submarine could approach undetected. When multiple submarines attacked at once, escort ships were forced to respond to several threats simultaneously. Another advantage for the submarines was the absence of aircraft in many areas of the Atlantic. Aircraft were extremely effective at spotting submarines on the surface, but their range was limited. Once convoys moved far enough from land bases, the skies above them often remained empty. In these regions, submarines could operate with far less risk of aerial detection. These factors combined to give U-boats a significant advantage during the early stages of the Atlantic campaign. Submarines could patrol vast areas of ocean, coordinate attacks against convoys, and retreat beneath the water before escorts could respond effectively. For a time, it seemed that the Atlantic itself favored the submarine fleet, despite the growing number of escort ships protecting Allied convoys. One enormous weakness still existed in the Atlantic defense system. This weakness was not caused by poor tactics or weak ships. It was caused by distance. The Atlantic Ocean was simply too large for land-based aircraft to cover completely. Patrol planes operating from Britain, Iceland, or North America could protect convoys for part of their journey. But once those ships moved far enough into the ocean, aircraft coverage disappeared entirely. In the middle of the Atlantic, there existed a vast region where no Allied aircraft could reach. Naval planners began referring to this region as the Mid-Atlantic Air Gap. It stretched across hundreds of miles of ocean between the patrol ranges of Allied air bases. Convoys entering this zone could no longer rely on aircraft scanning the sea ahead of them. Instead, they were protected only by their escort ships, destroyers, corvettes, and other anti-submarine vessels tasked with guarding the formation. For German U-boat commanders, this gap quickly became the most valuable part of the Atlantic battlefield. Submarine crews understood that aircraft were one of the most dangerous threats they could face. From high above the ocean, a patrol plane could spot a submarine traveling on the surface long before the submarine realized it had been detected. Aircraft could also attack quickly with depth charges, forcing submarines to dive before they were ready to strike a convoy. But inside the Mid-Atlantic Air Gap, that threat disappeared. In these distant waters, U-boats could operate with far greater confidence. Submarines often traveled on the surface at night to recharge their batteries and increase speed. Without aircraft overhead, this maneuver carried far less risk. Commanders could observe convoy routes, maneuver into attack positions, and coordinate wolfpack operations without worrying that a patrol aircraft might suddenly appear above them. Convoys crossing the ocean had no choice but to pass through this dangerous region. Even the strongest escort groups could only defend the immediate perimeter around the merchant ships. They could not see dozens of miles ahead of the convoy, and they could not patrol the sky. Submarines lurking beyond sonar range could shadow the formation for hours or even days before launching their attacks. This created a predictable pattern across the Atlantic campaign. Convoys might travel safely near coastal waters where aircraft could patrol overhead. But once they entered the central Atlantic, the situation changed dramatically. Submarine attacks became more frequent, and escort ships were forced to fight off threats coming from multiple directions. German Naval Command understood the importance of this region very well. As long as the air gap existed, U-boats would always have a place in the Atlantic where they could operate without constant surveillance. The ocean was vast, and within that vastness lay a corridor where submarines believed they could continue hunting almost undisturbed. For a time, that belief seemed justified. To protect vital supply routes across the Atlantic, Allied naval planners relied heavily on the convoy system. Instead of allowing merchant ships to travel alone across the ocean, dozens of cargo vessels sailed together in large groups, escorted by warships. These convoys carried everything from food and fuel to tanks, aircraft parts, and ammunition that Allied forces depended on to continue the war effort. The idea behind the system was simple. A large group of ships guarded by escorts would be harder for submarines to attack than individual vessels crossing the ocean alone. In many ways, the convoy system did improve the survival chances of merchant ships. Escort vessels such as destroyers and corvettes patrolled the perimeter of the convoy, scanning the water with sonar equipment designed to detect submarines below the surface. If a submarine attempted to approach the convoy underwater, escort ships could respond by dropping depth charges in the area, forcing the submarine to retreat or risk serious damage. However, the convoy system also introduced certain limitations that submarine commanders learned to exploit. One of the most important weaknesses was speed. A convoy could only move as fast as its slowest ship, which often meant a steady pace of 8 to 10 knots across the ocean. This slow movement made convoys predictable once their location and course were known. A submarine that discovered a convoy could track its movement and estimate where it would be hours later, allowing other submarines to move into position for an attack. Another challenge for convoy escorts was the sheer size of the formation they had to protect. A convoy might contain dozens of merchant ships arranged in several columns, stretching across a wide area of ocean. Escort ships patrolled around this formation, but even a well-organized escort group could not watch every direction at once. Submarines approaching from different angles could create confusion among the escorts, especially if several attacks occurred at the same time. Nighttime conditions often made the situation even more difficult. In darkness, submarines could travel on the surface where they were faster and easier to maneuver. A surfaced submarine could slip between the escort ships and position itself near the convoy without being detected immediately. From there, torpedoes could be launched at close range against multiple targets before the submarine submerged again. These weaknesses did not mean the convoy system failed entirely. Many merchant ships successfully crossed the Atlantic because of escort protection. But from the perspective of U-boat commanders, the convoy system still presented opportunities. With patience and coordination, submarines could infiltrate the defenses and strike valuable cargo vessels before disappearing back into the depths. As long as convoys had to cross the vast Atlantic without continuous air protection, submarine commanders believed they would always find ways to attack. The ocean was large, the escorts were limited, and the convoys had no choice but to keep moving across the same dangerous waters. As submarine attacks continued across the Atlantic, Allied naval commanders realized that the convoy system alone could not fully solve the problem. Escort ships could defend convoys at close range, but they were limited by the distance their sensors could detect threats beneath the water. Submarines operating beyond that range often had time to maneuver into position before the escorts could respond. This meant that U-boat commanders could still observe convoys from a distance, coordinate attacks with other submarines, and launch torpedoes before disappearing beneath the waves. Allied planners began searching for ways to detect submarines much earlier, long before they reached the convoy itself. The key to this problem lay in the use of aircraft. Patrol aircraft had already proven to be extremely effective at spotting submarines traveling on the surface. From the air, a submarine could be detected more easily than from a ship because the aircraft could scan large areas of ocean in a short amount of time. Even if a submarine attempted to dive, once an aircraft appeared, the aircraft could still attack quickly with depth charges or guide escort ships toward the submarine's location. However, aircraft faced the same limitation that had allowed submarines to operate so freely in the first place: range. Land-based patrol aircraft could protect convoys near the coast of Europe or North America. But once the convoy moved deeper into the Atlantic, Those aircraft had to turn back before reaching the center of the ocean. This created the mid-Atlantic air gap, where submarines operated without the constant threat of aerial detection. To close this gap, Allied naval planners began experimenting with a new concept. Instead of relying entirely on land-based aircraft, they explored ways to bring aircraft directly into the convoy itself. This idea led to the development and deployment of escort carriers, smaller aircraft carriers designed specifically to travel alongside convoys. Unlike the large fleet carriers used in major naval battles, escort carriers were built primarily to support anti-submarine operations in the Atlantic. Escort carriers carried a limited number of aircraft, but even a small group of planes could dramatically expand the convoy's defensive reach. These aircraft could take off from the carrier's deck and patrol the surrounding ocean for submarines attempting to approach. Instead of waiting for a submarine to attack, the convoy's aircraft could actively search for threats many miles away from the ships. This concept represented a major shift in strategy. Rather than allowing submarines to choose the time and place of their attacks, Allied forces would begin searching the ocean for submarines before they ever reached the convoy formation. If this system worked as intended, the open Atlantic, once considered a safe hunting ground for U-boats, would become far more dangerous for submarine crews themselves. Once escort carriers began joining Atlantic convoys, a major change occurred in how the ocean was monitored. For the first time, aircraft could patrol the same distant waters that submarines had previously considered safe territory. Instead of relying solely on destroyers and corvettes to defend the convoy, aircraft now took off from the deck of escort carriers and began sweeping large areas of ocean surrounding the merchant ships. These patrol flights dramatically expanded the convoy's defensive reach. Aircraft were particularly effective in anti-submarine operations because they could cover vast distances much faster than ships. A patrol aircraft, flying several hundred meters above the ocean, could scan miles of water in every direction. Submarines traveling on the surface were often easier to detect from the air than from a ship at sea level. The shape of the submarine's hull, cutting through the water, or the wake trailing behind it could sometimes reveal its position long before the submarine crew realized they had been spotted. When an aircraft detected a submarine, the situation could change within seconds. Patrol aircraft carried weapons designed specifically for attacking submarines. Depth charges could be dropped into the water near a submarine attempting to dive, creating powerful underwater explosions capable of damaging the vessel. In some cases, aircraft were also equipped with rockets or machine guns that could strike a submarine still on the surface before it had time to submerge. Even when the aircraft did not destroy the submarine, the mere presence of aircraft patrols forced submarines to change how they operated. Submarines relied heavily on traveling at the surface during certain parts of their patrols. On the surface, they could move faster and recharge their batteries using diesel engines. Once aircraft patrols began covering larger sections of the Atlantic, surfacing became far more dangerous. A submarine caught on the surface by a patrol aircraft might have only seconds to dive before the aircraft attacked. This constant pressure limited the freedom that submarine commanders once enjoyed. Instead of positioning themselves comfortably ahead of convoy routes, submarines had to remain cautious and spend more time underwater. While submerged, submarines moved more slowly and had limited battery power, making it harder for them to intercept convoys or maintain contact with their targets. For U-boat commanders, this development signaled a turning point in the Atlantic campaign. The ocean had once seemed large enough to hide submarines almost anywhere. But with aircraft now searching the same waters, that vast ocean no longer guaranteed the safety it once provided. As aircraft patrols became a regular part of convoy operations, submarine commanders began to experience a gradual but significant change in the Atlantic battlefield. For years, U-boats had relied on mobility and surprise to intercept convoys. Submarines could patrol shipping routes freely, surface when necessary to move quickly, and position themselves ahead of convoys preparing coordinated attacks. The arrival of escort aircraft disrupted this pattern. Aircraft flying from escort carriers created a moving surveillance zone around the convoy. Instead of approaching undetected across open water, submarines now had to pass through areas actively searched from above. Patrol aircraft flew wide arcs around the convoy, scanning the ocean surface for submarines attempting to maneuver into position. This meant that submarines could be detected much earlier in their approach, sometimes dozens of miles from the merchant ships. For a submarine commander attempting to organize an attack, this early detection created a serious problem. If an aircraft spotted the submarine while it was traveling on the surface, the crew had to dive immediately to avoid attack. Diving protected the submarine temporarily, but it also slowed the vessel dramatically. Submarines underwater relied on electric motors powered by batteries, which limited both their speed and the distance they could travel before needing to surface again. This restriction made it difficult for submarines to maintain contact with convoys once they were forced underwater. A convoy moving steadily across the Atlantic could gradually move out of reach, while the submarine struggled to reposition itself below the surface. Even if the submarine eventually surfaced again, aircraft patrols might still be operating nearby, forcing another dive and disrupting the attack once more. Aircraft also coordinated closely with the convoy's escort ships. When a patrol plane detected a submarine or suspected submarine activity, it could radio the convoy escorts and guide them toward the area. Destroyers and corvettes could then move quickly to investigate, using sonar equipment to search for the submerged submarine. This cooperation between aircraft and ships created a defensive system that was far more effective than either method alone. Over time, submarine commanders realized that the freedom they once enjoyed in the Atlantic was disappearing. The ocean might still be vast, but aircraft patrols meant that large sections of water were constantly being watched. Submarines attempting to approach convoys now had to consider not only the escort ships guarding the formation, but also the aircraft scanning the skies above. For crews who had once believed the Atlantic was too large for effective surveillance, this new reality marked a major shift in the nature of the submarine campaign. As escort carriers and patrol aircraft became more common in Atlantic convoy operations, their influence gradually spread across the shipping routes connecting North America and Europe. What had started as an experimental solution to the mid-Atlantic air gap soon became a standard part of convoy protection. Instead of relying solely on escort ships to defend merchant vessels, convoys now carried their own air support capable of scanning large areas of ocean for submarine activity. This new layer of defense significantly altered how submarine commanders approached convoy attacks. Previously, U-boats could patrol large sections of ocean with relative confidence that no aircraft would appear overhead. Submarines often traveled on the surface at night to move quickly and position themselves ahead of convoys. Once in place, they could launch coordinated torpedo attacks before diving beneath the waves again. With aircraft now patrolling above the convoy routes, these tactics became far more difficult to execute. Patrol aircraft could detect submarines from long distances while they were traveling on the surface. Even a brief sighting from the air could force the submarine to dive and abandon its position. Once submerged, the submarine's speed dropped dramatically, making it harder to intercept the convoy again. Aircraft also made it possible to search for submarines beyond the immediate convoy perimeter. Instead of waiting for submarines to approach the merchant ships, patrol aircraft could investigate suspicious contacts far from the convoy itself. This meant submarines were often detected before they were close enough to launch an attack. In many cases, submarines spent more time avoiding aircraft patrols than preparing torpedo strikes. Another important change was the coordination between aircraft and escort ships. When a patrol aircraft detected a submarine, it could mark the location and guide nearby escort vessels toward the area. Destroyers and corvettes could then deploy sonar and depth charges in an attempt to track the submarine underwater. This cooperation created a layered defense that extended far beyond the range of any single escort ship. For U-boat commanders, the result was a steady decline in operational freedom. The vast Atlantic Ocean still offered many hiding places, but the presence of aircraft meant those hiding places were becoming harder to rely on. Submarines that once operated confidently in open waters now faced increasing pressure from both the sea and the sky. The ocean itself had not changed. Its size and distance remained the same. What had changed was the ability of Allied forces to observe and respond across that enormous battlefield. Aircraft had effectively extended the convoy's vision far beyond the horizon, transforming the Atlantic from a hunting ground into a far more contested environment. By the later stages of the Battle of the Atlantic, the strategic situation facing German submarine commanders had changed significantly from the early years of the campaign. Submarines had once operated across enormous areas of ocean with relatively little fear of aerial detection. The vast distances of the Atlantic and the limited reach of Allied aircraft allowed U-boats to patrol shipping routes, track convoys, and organize coordinated attacks with considerable freedom. For a time, the size of the ocean itself had served as a kind of shield. The growing presence of escort carriers and long-range patrol aircraft gradually weakened that advantage. Convoys crossing the Atlantic were no longer isolated groups of ships relying solely on their escort vessels for protection. Aircraft flying from escort carriers now searched the surrounding ocean for submarines attempting to approach the convoy. These patrols extended the defensive perimeter far beyond what escort ships could achieve alone. As aircraft patrols expanded, submarines were increasingly detected before they could position themselves for an attack. A submarine spotted on the surface might be forced to dive immediately, losing both speed and visibility. Once underwater, the submarine could travel only slowly, using electric motors powered by batteries. If the convoy continued moving forward while the submarine remained submerged, the opportunity to launch a torpedo attack could disappear entirely. The coordination between aircraft and escort ships further complicated submarine operations. When an aircraft detected a submarine or suspected submarine activity, it could transmit the location to nearby escort vessels. Destroyers and corvettes could then move quickly toward the reported position and begin searching with sonar equipment. This cooperation created a layered defensive system in which submarines faced pressure from both above and below the water. For submarine commanders who had once believed the Atlantic Ocean was simply too vast to control, this new system demonstrated the opposite. Aircraft patrols meant that large sections of ocean could now be observed continuously, even far from land. Submarines still possessed stealth and the ability to dive beneath the waves, but their freedom of movement was increasingly limited by the constant threat of aerial detection. The Atlantic remained one of the largest battlefields of the war, and submarines continued to operate within it. Yet the conditions that once made the ocean a safe hunting ground had changed. Aircraft searching the skies above the convoy routes ensured that the ocean alone was no longer enough to guarantee invisibility.